The 5-Factor Model of Personality, Part 3. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. In our third and final installment on the 5-Factor Model of Personality, we'll talk about a few applications and uses of the 5-Factor Model. We'll talk about where the 5-Factor Model has been used in research across different data sources. And in addition, we will discuss, my assessment of the 5-Factor Model of Personality. So, let's get going. Now, the 4-factor model has been used in a variety of areas. In my own research with David Buss and Todd Shackelford, we investigated dating and mating in the 5-factor model. We used samples of dating couples and newlywed couples, and we found modest assortative mating for the big 5 traits. Assortative mating is the notion that people are attracted to each other based on similar characteristics. We also assessed their mate preferences for each of the 5 traits and found those were strongly correlated with both the individual's ratings of their own traits and their ratings of their partner's traits. In a twist to the study, we calculated different scores between the observer ratings of the partner and the preference ratings of the partner. We found the bigger the difference, the less marital satisfaction, with 2 special caveats. Women were far more upset with the mismatch than men, and the mismatch was mainly for the trait of agreeableness versus quarrelsomeness. So, bottom line, find someone kind of like you in terms of personality traits. Now, we also can look at combinations of the 5 factors traits that can be used to describe different behaviors individuals may perform. And then these are results that were taken from the Larson and Buss personality textbook we use in class. Good grades. I hope you all strive for good grades. Good grades is a combination of conscientiousness and emotional stability, both naturally on the high side. Educational attainment and earnings. That's something that every college student is interested in. Those individuals that perform highly in college and do very well in the business world tend to be highly positive in emotional stability, openness to experience, and conscientiousness. Risky sexual behaviors. Behaviors these days can kill you. Individuals who engage in risky sexual behavior tend to be extroverted, neurotic, unconscientious, and quarrelsome. So watch out for those folks. Pathological gamblers. High neuroticism, low conscientiousness. And this guy doesn't look very conscientious as he's pondering over his hand. One interesting area is that the big 5 have been found to be robust across different sources of data, including these. There's much agreement between self-rating and observer rating of the big 5, and you find that this is consistent across types of raters, whether they're employers, whether they're romantic partners, friends, teachers, other types of observers. Agreement between self and observer, fairly robust for the big 5. Also, employer ratings, as I mentioned earlier, consistent with self-ratings of the Big Five. Probably the most perplexing finding for Big Five research is stranger ratings. Stranger ratings seem to be extremely consistent with the Big Five. Pacini and Norman in the 1960s did a study where they placed individuals who were unacquainted with each other across a table and had them rate the person for each of the 5-factor traits. Sure enough, the trait model ended up being fairly robust, and the findings were consistent with other Big Five research. This caused a lot of people to start thinking about exactly what the Big Five are. And some people believe that the 5 factors are simply traits in your head that you project onto other people to predict their behavior. Other individuals believe that we do have these traits, they guide our behavior, and they become a useful tool for measuring other people's personalities, even on a lay level. Think about what you know when you know these 5 things about another person. So, how extroverted they are? Think about it in terms of maybe a professor that you're going to take for a class. Are they extroverted or outgoing, or are they extremely withdrawn and introverted? The introverted professor's probably not much fun. If the professor's too extroverted, well, you never may get a chance to get a word in edgewise. Do you want a neurotic professor who's kind of anxiety-ridden and is going to drive you crazy during the semester? Or do you want someone way on the other end that has Ferris Bueller disease, and you have the Ben Stein character in there with no affect sitting there going, Bueller, Bueller, Bueller? Probably someplace in the middle there. You probably want an agreeable, friendly professor, someone you can get along with rather than someone who's quarrelsome and arguing every point with you. You also probably want a professor who is conscientious and will show up for class on time, will grade papers and exams in a timely manner, and basically just do their job well. You can probably get in big trouble with an unconscientious professor. My son once had a professor who didn't stick to his syllabus, and he had 3 tests on the last 3 days of class. To me, this sounds just utterly absurd, but this individual had to keep to some kind of schedule that he had missed all semester, so he played catch-up the last 3 days, and it affected his students very negatively. Finally, openness to experience. Do you want a professor who's educated, who's well informed on current issues in their field, and looking at the latest and greatest research? Or do you want someone who thinks the last bit of good research was done when they were in graduate school 147 years ago, and that's proved by his or her kind of brittle yellow pad notes that are handwritten? So you know quite a bit about an individual if you know these 5 things about them, and they can be measured in a variety of ways. There's been robust evidence for the 5-factor model across a variety of cultures. I have some of them listed here. You find that this is not totally consistent. For example, during our culture lecture, I will tell you about the Spanish model of personality and also a Chinese model of personality, where the 5 traits are there, but they're blended with other things. I believe that a lot of this cross-cultural evidence for the Big Five is fairly good. However, much of it is limited by the fact that individuals in those countries were selected to participate because they spoke English and they filled out English versions of trait rating forms. probably not the best way to do cross-cultural research. Well, what are these 5 factors? People like Costa and McCrae, who reinvigorated the Big Five during the late 1980s, believe that there are 5 traits, no more than 5 traits, and every behavior that we perform is some combination of those traits, like we talked about before. The other main thing you want to remember about the Big Five is they're not a theoretical model of traits, as is, for example, Eysenk's and Wiggins' models. These are 5 traits that have been demonstrated to come out of sophisticated statistical analyses, and their taxonomy, simply descriptive categories. And although they do map onto other models of traits, and there is some biological evidence for some of the 5 factors, there is very little biological evidence for agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, as you would expect. So, more work needs to be done in this area. As I talked about just previously, the Big Five overlaps other trait models, and we find that there's extroversion in both Eysenk's and the Big Five model. Basically, you will find extroversion and neuroticism or some other form of dominance, which sometimes can blend with extroversion, in any good trait model of personality. One of the other big questions that often comes up is, are 5 traits enough to describe something as sophisticated as human personality? Well, these are 5 big global traits that do, as Warren Norman said in his classic article on the 5 factors, and I've stolen and put into the subheading of the title page of this lecture, an adequate taxonomy of personality. The Big Fivers, especially the early ones, never said this was the final, latest, greatest trait model. And there are many individuals questing to find the 6th factor. Since some variables were excluded from early Big Five analyses, especially those related to sex and gender, there's good possibility that there are factors beyond the Big Five that are relatively important, and we have to figure out those things in the future. Another candidate that I personally have as a 6th factor is intelligence. Intelligence is somewhat correlated with openness to experience, but not extremely. And I tend to have the belief that intelligent people behave differently than people low on the intelligence scale, and enough to make systematic life differences there, especially if you look at some old work like Terman's classic work on gifted children. So, school's still out on that one, and when you wait a few more years, you might be talking about the 6-factor model or the 7-factor model. Time will tell. So, my perspective on the Big Five, let me get up here in the middle of the screen for you. I think the Big Five are a good set of traits. They're interesting to study. You can explain much of human behavior in the context of these 5 traits. Are they the only trait model that's worth studying? Absolutely not. What you should do always, if you're doing personality research, is look for that trait model or those specific personality traits that are most relevant to your construct. Right now, the Big Five's getting lots of attention, and some categories of the Big Five, or different blends, are getting exceedingly more attention. For example, Del Paulus's dark triad model of negative traits are based on, blends of the 5 factors. So I think the Big Five is a good start. It gives us a common tool for discussing personality, which is extremely useful. Way before I was a personality psychologist in the 1970s, many personality psychologists spent considerable time attempting to position their model of traits above other model of traits. And people would argue in the literature about which was the right number of traits and what was the right conceptualization for each trait. And now that we have the Big Five, we've been able to agree on these 5 robust traits. So I think that's been a very good thing. Big Five is becoming fairly ubiquitous. You even find it showing up in popular magazines and things like that. So that's the Big Five, and this ends our unit on personality traits. Take care. Bye. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020, Professor Michael Botwin, all rights reserved.